Good morning. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to make this presentation. This is going to be more speculative in terms of the application of using oximetry beyond just looking at issues related to the eye. So what I aim to do this morning is, of course, everybody here probably knows about this, a brief outline of the development of retinal imaging, and then go on to discuss alternative uses of retinal and choroidal oximetry for patient monitoring purposes, and then finally move on to an issue which, in terms of global health, is really important in terms of trying to monitor stroke prognosis, not stroke diagnosis, but prognosis. So, in 1851, Helmholtz invented the first ophthalmoscope, and then within 2 years of that, Van Triet then produced a colour image of the fundus, and then it took some time because of the developments in both illumination and photographic recording before we actually had some photographic records of the fundus. But by the turn of the 20th century, Dimmer produced an atlas, and in 1908 he produced a photograph which we can see all the recognisable features of the fundus. And since then, the advances in both technology in terms of optics as well as data recording and analysis have allowed us to move to the point whereby we're using oximetry for diagnostic purposes to look at specifically eye disease. So further development of image capture and analysis advanced this capability, and that we know that the characteristics of fundus reflection exist from a variety of structures and cells, and that in terms of oximetry we're essentially interested in this portion in terms of hemoglobin, oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and the reflective properties of the light that comes back. So the question then is the scope for translating fundus imaging purposes from just looking at the eye to other methods of disease or prognosis. We already know that the choroidal blood flow is about 20 times higher than retinal blood flow reported by Bill and Sperber in 1990, and it suggests therefore that if we want to look at oximetry, maybe the choroid is more sensitive to changes in oxygen saturation, certainly inspired oxygen. And this is a paper from Christian Dottier, in which the ODR here represents oxygenation, and we can see that the higher the oxygenation, the lower the ODR, and measured in the choroidal vessels is about the same as the vortex veins, but it's lower than the retinal arterials, suggesting that there's a higher oxygenation here in the choroid, and certainly much higher than in the retinal venules. That same group published a paper in which they then measured changes in optical density of the choroid from both the choroid and retinal circulation as a function of either normoxia or hyperoxia. So in this instance they gave people 100% oxygen, and what they recorded was that the ODR in the choroidal vessels went down in some patients, went down in some subjects, suggesting that there was a higher oxygenation with hyperoxia. Around about the same thing in terms of the retinal arterioles, and a big change in the retinal venules, which suggests that the direction of change in oxygenation in the choroid is the same as that seen in the retinal circulation. Here with Andy Harvey, we use the fundus camera to record red eye reflection. So rather than looking at the oximetry directly from the choroidal circulation, we use the red eye reflection to see if it was a useful indicator of choroidal oxygen saturation, and therefore we measured the intensity ratio of reflected light. Using the camera at two separate wavelengths, we recorded the red eye reflection in both eyes, and in this experiment they switched from either inhaling a normoxic gas mixture, 21% oxygen, to hypoxia, 15% oxygen, and recorded the red eye, recorded the intensity ratio of red eye reflection. And we can see here that there's some scatter between the 10 individuals, but on average, when they move from normoxia to hypoxia, this intensity ratio falls, and then we move back to inhaling a normoxic gas mixture, and this intensity ratio increases, suggesting that the choroid is quite sensitive to detecting changes in inspired oxygen reflected by a change in oxygenation. So maybe using red eye reflection could be used as an alternative to something like pulse oximetry. And the reason why I suggest this is here we've got the red infrared ratio for oxygen saturation during pulse oximetry. So it's around about 0.4 to 0.6 when we have full saturation, and this intensity ratio increases as that saturation falls off. But if you have, for example, impaired circulation and you're trying to measure pulse oximetry, one of the algorithms that are trying to detect pulsatile flow will increase the light intensity, which increases the signal to noise ratio. And the problem there is that you then could lead to an incorrect estimation of O2 saturation. So it may be the case that the use of the choroid could be a better measure of systemic oxygen saturation, since choroidal circulation should be less prone to the effects of either hypoperfusion due to cold or shock. So the next step here is maybe to have an experimental model in which it's possible to manipulate central venous pressure, and then look at the reflex from altering central venous pressure to see whether or not that affects choroidal oximetry, or to use temperature stress in which the periphery shuts down, but you shouldn't see any effect in terms of choroidal oximetry, whilst the pulse oximetry signal should actually decrease. So choroidal oximetry, I think, has some promise in terms of application as a means of measuring systemic arterial saturation. What about using retinal oximetry? Well, we know that stroke or cerebral vascular accident occurs about 17 million times a year across the world, which is approximately once every 2 seconds. Cardiovascular disease remains the highest single cause of death, but across the world, stroke ranks as the second highest. In the UK alone, we have about 1.2 million survivors of stroke. And one of the issues here about stroke survival is that 1 out of every 10 survivors, 3 go on to suffer from a further stroke or a transient ischemic attack. So if you have somebody that's had a stroke, one of the key things that you want to do then is to make sure, or to try and monitor whether or not that patient is at risk of having a further stroke or a further transient ischemic attack. So maybe retinal oximetry might be one of the solutions. And the reason why I say this is that in 1982, Tachibana used changes in posture to look at retinal reactivity. And what they found is that across age, this change in diameter of the retinal vessels becomes less as an effect of the change in posture, suggesting that with aging we have some changes in vascular function. With Tusha Chowdhury, we used a modified fundus camera and the iris system to co-register 8 images of the retina at different wavelengths. And what we did here was that we looked at oxygen saturation under normoxic and hypoxic conditions and measured those in both the arterial and venual circulation. And what we found is that if you make somebody hypoxic, both the retinal arterioles register a decrease in oxygen saturation, and so too do the venules. So put somebody who's hypoxic and we can see that change in oxygen saturation, and that's a finding that's been reported over the last day and a half, so nothing new here. The other thing that we did was that the analysis also included some vessel tracking, and that was utilised to allow us to measure vessel diameter. So here we see retinal arterial O2 saturation under normoxia, and it falls during hypoxia, a significant change. Similar with the retinal venual O2 saturation, a decrease in O2 saturation under hypoxia. Using fingertip pulse oxygen saturation, we saw the same effect, so the direction in using pulse oximetry is in the same direction as using retinal oximetry. But the thing I want to emphasise here is that not only did we see a change in O2 saturation, but we also see that the arteriolar diameter increases under conditions of hypoxia. And that change in vessel diameter tells us something about cerebral reactivity. So here we might have a technique in which, if the retinal circulation is a reflection of cerebral reactivity, that we've now got an indirect measure, a biomarker, for whether or not we can use retinal oximetry as a prognostic tool for stroke recovery. Brain blood flow is more receptive to a change in PCO2 than it is to PO2, because it has a feedback mechanism based around the acid-base balance, and the fact that if you change PCO2, it will change this hydrogen ion concentration, which automatically feeds into these chemoreceptors, which changes the ventilation. They're changing gas exchange, so the PCO2 might be a more sensitive measure or a more sensitive technique to try and affect brain blood flow than altering PO2. So maybe the simultaneous application of oximetry and vessel tracking during exposure to changes in PCO2 could be used to assess vascular reactivity. And certainly yesterday Gerhard presented some data whereby subjects were inhaling 5% and 8% CO2 and recorded some changes in blood flow. Now, the idea of using carbon dioxide to increase cerebral blood flow isn't anything new, and it's currently used by the Edinburgh Research Centre when they look at MRI scans. But of course, MRI scans are really expensive, plus they require a scanner, which is usually based in a specialised facility, and maybe the case could be made, or certainly some studies could be done, in which we utilise this PCO2 to look at retinal oximetry and vessel diameter as a surrogate measure of cerebral blood flow reactivity. So, to conclude, the development of fundus imaging techniques to detect and diagnose eye disease remains a fundamental tool in ophthalmology. But I think that yesterday Ina was talking about wider applications. I think that fundus imaging combined with diagnostic procedures could allow us to assess vascular reactivity and or systemic oxygen availability, and appears to offer some promise in translation as a biomarker for assessing physiological function. Thank you for listening. I'd just like to acknowledge people across different projects that we started from Abertay University, Edinburgh and Glasgow. Thank you very much.